In this screencast, I want to go ahead and start talking about modularization. And the way we do this in coding is using functions. So up until this point, we've dealt with fairly small applications, and we used our process checklist to ensure that we're fulfilling all the requirements of what our problem statement indicated. Okay, so what happens when the problem statement asks you to do something really complicated? Um, what would happen is that our process checklist would get really complicated, and that's fine. So software can handle complex things, but as a developer, it's really hard to manage my code versus is it working? So when we build our process checklist, we're really, while we're building out our code, we're checking, is the code that we built functional? Does it fulfill the requirements that we want? Is it moving towards our goal? And as these programs get more and more complicated, that check of, is this working, is it accomplishing our goal, becomes more and more complicated because the tasks are more and more complicated. Okay, so the idea is that as our process checklist becomes more and more complicated, we can modularize some of the process checklist items. And the idea there is that we take a complex task, that might have 20 steps to it, and we break it out into a separate milestone to say, did we accomplish those 20 tasks? And then tomorrow we'll accomplish the next 20 tasks. And then the next day we'll accomplish the next 20 tasks or whatever it is. Okay, so that's what modularization is. And modularization is, we define our process checklist, and we've kind of dealt with our checklist. We define our variables, we prompt the user. Like, those things are not necessarily terribly difficult in terms of a time frame, but we're going to run into problems that have a lot of processing steps. So what we can do in JavaScript is we can write a function that's going to handle some of the complexity for us. It's going to isolate some of that complexity for us. Okay, the way this application works, the way our JavaScript class works, is that we have a controller module. And the idea with the controller module is that's kind of the starting point for our application. In object-oriented programming, so when you go over to the Java class, you're going to have a main method that's going to execute first. So something that starts up your application. Okay, so the way this JavaScript class handles it is that there's a method called the controller, and the controller will then call the various functions that would make up your process checklist. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to skip over to some JavaScript and HTML code. So skipping over to Adam. I have a little bit different setup. So I'm not working through your demos, and I'm not working through your learning unit assignments or labs or anything like that. I have a raw HTML page that's referencing a JavaScript file called modules.js. And what I want to do is I want to invoke a function called the controller. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to have a script block, and I'm going to call the method called the controller. So I'm invoking that function. That's how I'm kicking off our application so that it gets into our starting point. Okay, so then I have this external file, modules.js. This file exists, and it's empty. What I want to do is I want to write a function definition called the controller that's going to be the starting point of our application. So I'm going to go ahead and have a function called the controller. And the syntax for this is I use the function keyword, the name of the function, beginning and ending parentheses, and then all of the logic and all of the checklist items that I would have to have are going to go in between these curly braces. So the actual code is going to go in between the curly braces. So for the first part, let's just make sure that it's working. Okay, so what we should see is if I open up this HTML page, I'm opening up that HTML page in a browser, you can see that I get that it works. Okay, so the idea here is that let's say we wanted to build out a report. And our report, so our report builder is going to be something like this. We're going to have our process checklist, or our problem statement is going to be output a report header. output report details, and then output a report footer with summary info. Okay, so that's the idea. Is this is our process checklist. Okay, so we're going to output a report header, and our report header, let's just use a table to handle this. So I want to use an HTML table. So I could do all of that in the controller. I could say output a table, output my report header, output my report details, output the footer. Depending on how many rows and columns and stuff like that, I could embed it all in the controller. But a more organized approach would be, I want to build the report header, and then I want to be able to check it to see did it work. Okay, so I'm going to have a function called build report header. Okay, and the idea here is that I can write code that's going to build a report header, and I can check to see if it's working. Okay, so with a report header, what I really want to do is I want to build a table row, and then I want to build a couple of TH tags. So these are my table heading tags. So let's say it's first name and last name and email. Okay, so this is going to be my table heading, and then I got to close up my row. So I want to output this. This is the idea, is that I'm going to build my report header. Okay, so I'm going to have a comment here indicating what's going on with this function. Outputs the first row of my table as a table header. Okay, that's what the function does. So the function name, build report header, I can use that and I can invoke that report header. So the way I'm going to call that function is I first am going to build the report header. So down below in my controller, this is my starting point. I output that it works, and then I build my report header. The problem with this is my report header doesn't include anything about my table. So the way I want to handle this is I want to use document.write. I'm just going to output an HTML table. So here's the beginning table tag. And then I'm going to have, at the end of this, I'm going to output a closing HTML table. Okay, so then we should be able to see, once we've invoked our build report header, we should be able to see that table heading, that one row that we've built. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this, and I'm going to use document.write. I'm going to put all that in quotes and a semicolon to close this. Okay, so what's going to happen is my starting point is the controller. That's what's getting called from my HTML. So this function gets called. We output that it works. We output our beginning table. We output the header, which is this function call. So if I'm looking at the code, I execute line 20, then I execute line 22, then I hit line 24, and it says, oh, you want me to build the report header? I need to come up to line 11 and execute this function. Once it's done, it returns back to line 24, and then we can go forward from there. So line 26 executes. Okay, so it kind of seems out of order. Build report header comes before the controller, but that's not the way it's working. The controller's getting called. We hit the build report header, and then we jump to that spot in our code. Okay, so if I go ahead and save this, I can go back over to my browser, and we can verify that we have a table. Okay, so here's our first name, last name, email, and if I want, maybe it makes sense to put a border around our table. So I can refresh this, and then you'll see the border. Okay, so there's our table. Right now it's just the report header. And I can verify, hey, this is done. Okay, so I know it's working. I've checked that part of my process checklist off. Okay, so then next I want to go ahead and build my report details. Okay, and what you have done in class so far, and if you've worked through some of the labs, is you've used a data set. So you've used a data set where you're going to loop through and you're going to say, while there are more records, while there are more employees, while there's more students. So all of that detail. I'm only going to build a couple of report details. So first name, last name, email. I'm not going to have it in a loop or anything like that. But the idea is that I'm going to build a couple of rows. And instead of using TH tags, I'm going to use TD tags. So I'm going to use table data tags. Okay, so I'm using TD tags instead of TH tags. But I am building rows. So with the first name, last name, and email address. So I'm going to just copy this. And I'm going to use document.write. And I'm going to output some details. So let's go ahead and do 3 detail records. So first name will be Bill, last name will be Gates, and then the email will be bgates@hotmail.com. And then we can do Steve Jobs, and then email of sjobs@mac.com, and then we can use Jeff Bezos. Jeff@amazon.com. Okay, so we have some details now for our report, and the way we want this to work is we start our table, we output some table heading information, and then we want to build some report details. Okay, so we're going to call that method before we close our table. Okay, and the idea here is that this is going to add some table records to our table. Okay, so I'm going to skip over to my browser, and I can verify that my table now has some records. And you'll notice that the email is still bolded in the output, so something looks wrong to me. So if I'm looking at the email, you can see that I started the email with a TH, and I ended it with a TD, but that's why it's bolded. Okay, so now you can see my table. I have some table detail information. Okay, and then lastly, I've checked off the report details. Now it might be nice to have a summary. So I have the build report header, I have build report details, and now I'm going to have a function called build report summary. And the idea here is that instead of using 3 columns, I just want to use 2 columns. The first one indicating that I'm dealing with a total, and then maybe an employee count. So I'm going to just hard code this data. It might be that you've read employee records from a record set, and you want to output that information. And in the next video, we'll talk about how do I get that information? How do I pass information around? If I have a data set, how do I pass that information around? But for this case, what I really want to do is I always like to start off with the HTML that I want to generate. So I want to build a table row, and then I'm going to use a TD tag. So I'm using 2 TD tags instead of 3. And closing table row. And since I'm only using 2 TD tags, then I'm going to have an issue there. So I'm going to make this call span of 2. Okay. And so the first TD tag, what I want to do is I just want to indicate that, here's the total employee count. And then in the second TD tag, I'm going to tell you that there were 3 detail records. Okay, so this is what I'm going to use for document.write. So I'm outputting all of this information. The text that I want is employee count. And then the detail is going to be that there's 3 employees. Okay, so I have this build report summary method that I'm going to invoke after I've output the details. And now I can verify, did this actually work? So what I'm expecting is I have my header, I have my 3 detail records, and then at the bottom I have a summary indicating that there's 3 employees. Okay, and it looks a little bit goofy because I have the grid lines on my table, but I think that gives me an accurate summary. And we're really not looking at HTML tables. We're really looking at how do we deal with these functions. Okay, so with these functions, a couple of notes about the functions. When I write a function, the name should start with a verb. So in our case, it's build each time. And then it should give me a description of what's actually happening. So I'm building a report header, I'm building report details, I'm building a summary. Okay, so the function name is going to be important. It always is going to start with some verb, and it's always going to start with lowercase notation. The other thing that's important with functions is I should have a quick comment indicating what is going on with this function. So I'm going to have a comment above build report details. So instead of outputting the first row of my table as a table header, I'm outputting detail rows for my table. And then lastly, when I build my report summary, I'm outputting totals for my records in a summary format. Okay, so I have comments about my functions. I'm going to do the same thing for my controller. So I'm going to say that the controller outputs an entire table, including a header, details, and summary. Okay, and that's what the controller's doing. Okay, so I have comments about each of my functions. Nothing has really changed there, but I'm giving you a description about what's going on with each of my functions. Okay, so this is just kind of an introduction to modularization, like how do I deal with functions in JavaScript. So I'm going to have a starting point into my application. In our case, it's called the controller. In your labs, it might be lab 1, lab 2, lab 1 part 1, lab 1 part 2. So there's a starting point of your application, and then from that starting point, you're going to call out to different functions that are within your application that you've built. And now I can verify, like I had a 3-part process checklist, and I finished all 3 parts of my process checklist. And now I made this simple enough where our process checklist was only 3 items. But what if our report header was, I'm going to build a table header, then I got to escape out of there, style the table header, okay, get end user feedback, revise, test, distribute. Okay, so I could say all of those things are part of building a report header, and all I've really done is this step. Okay, so these process checklists can be many, many steps. When I style this, maybe I need to get graphics from my marketing department, and I have to have a graphic designer integrate those graphics so that they're styled correctly. So styling the table header might not be a one-person job. It might be a huge job depending on how styled this report is. Okay, then I'm going to get end user feedback. Well, what does that entail? Do I do a survey? Do I just talk to someone? Getting end user feedback might be multiple steps. Okay, the revisions might be multiple steps. So this could be, just building the report header could be a multiple week process, right? In our case, all we're talking about is some JavaScript code and building a function. So we're not talking about something that complicated, but this is the reason why it's important to modularize your code. Okay, so this is just an introduction. How do I define a function? How do I call the function? And how is the function going to execute? Okay, so this is part one of our series on functions.